Hey guys, as we begin our year of deep friendship, we thought it might be really helpful if we could put some resources out there for you guys that might help, one, clarify who we are as a people. As Christians, what is it that we believe? Who are we? What are we about? If we say we want to value the things that God values and when we care about the things that God cares about, what does it actually mean? Who is God? What do we believe about him? And so we're going to put out some resources for you guys. They're going to really focus on the essentials. One of our core values here at Redemption is that we are a church that wants to major on the majors and not ignore the minors, but not really quibble and quabble over the minors. So we're going to invite and welcome anyone here who wants to have different views of some of the minor things within Christianity. But when it comes to the essentials, we're going to stand pat. We're gonna draw a line in the sand and we're gonna say this is who we are and this is what we believe. And if you disagree with us, that's fine. We want to welcome you here. We want to invite you to be a part of that. But we are gonna very blatantly and very boldly hold on to those values. And so one of those is, who is God? What is he like? And so as we've started this year of deep friendship, and we've seen in John 1 this dynamic between Jesus, the Son of God, and the Father. One of the important aspects of who is the Christian God and what is he like comes to the forefront. And so in this first series here, we're just going to talk about the Trinity. We're going to talk about God as three in one and God as one in three. What does that mean? Why do we believe that? What makes that unique? And yeah, so hope you guys enjoy. We'll start with this fact that as we try to know God, as we try to wrap our head around God and who he is and what he's like, I think it's important for us to start here. The more we know about God, the less we'll actually know about God. Or to put it this way, the more that we know God, the more we're going to realize we can't ever really fully know God. We can't ever really fully comprehend and wrap our head around God. It doesn't mean we can't know anything about God. It just means that there will never ever be this level of certainty. There will never ever be this level of full comprehension where we can just wrap our full heads around who God is. And I think for a lot of us, this makes us uncomfortable because we kind of come from a Western mindset. We're taught to that if we can't understand something fully, then it must not be true. And I want to encourage you guys with a couple just thoughts up front. Number one, there's lots of things that we in every single day life we take for granted that we don't fully wrap our heads around and comprehend, and yet they're true, right? I don't know and can't fully comprehend how and why my car works, but I trust it to get me from point A to point B in the morning. I don't know fully how the love that I have for my wife works, and yet I get up and I love her every single day and trust that she loves me every single day. So there's lots of things that we can't comprehend. And if those little things like a car or my relationship with my wife, if those little things can't be fully comprehended, why would I begin to expect that I could wrap my head around God, the creator of all of these things? I shouldn't be able to. In fact, if there's one thing in this world that I should not be able to fully understand, I think it would be God. And so don't let mystery scare you. Instead, let the idea that as we look at God and as we talk about God, we're going to find lots of mystery. Let that be a cause for worship. Let that be something that makes you fall down on your face and go, "Oh Lord, who are you? That I should even kind of begin to know you and have a relationship with you." The bigness and the vastness of God. I think the Christian life does not offer us. It's not offering us a door to certainty. It's offering us a life into an invitation into mystery, a mystery into an eternal relationship with God, where we will forever continue to get to know more and more and more about him, but never fully plumb the depths of who he is and what he's like. So with that said, we're going to use that as a launching point to talk about the Trinity. That unknowability of God, in theological language, that's called transcendence. And there's two, like when we talk about who God is, there's two kind of big main pieces that I just kind of want to talk about first before we get into the details of the Trinity and where that comes from. The first is transcendence. So I think I spelled that right. So transcendence is the idea that God is other than. The Christian word for this, I guess, would be holy. That he is somehow outside of us, that he is outside of creation, he is bigger than creation, that he is something other than creation. That's transcendence. We believe that God is transcendent. We also, however, believe that God is immanent. When we talk about the immanence of God, we're talking about the nearness of God. Is God close to us? Can God be known? Right. So if we were to look at classical deism, for example, they're going to believe in the transcendence of God and reject the immanence of God. Right. That God has created the world and he has stepped away. He's removed himself from the world, so that anything that can be found in the world might tell us a little bit about him, but he is in no way, shape, or form involved in the world. Therefore, miracles, for example, are not possible. Resurrection is not possible. The incarnation is not necessarily possible. All of those would be immanence. Other religions might embrace immanence and reject transcendence. So that would be the idea that God is somehow contained within creation, that he is chained to creation. Maybe even he's a part of creation, or they are a part of creation if we're looking at polytheistic religions. And so these two big ideas become important because as Christians we affirm both of them. We do believe that God is outside of creation. He is the creator of all things. But we also believe that he is involved in creation and enters into creation, most notably would be in the person of Jesus. And it's here that our conversation about the Trinity actually begins. So to understand the Trinity, we could go about this a number of different ways. But I think probably most importantly is understanding why the Trinity, the concept of the Trinity even exists within the church. So the Trinity is not something that people just, Christians in the early church just sat around and made up. There's kind of this online old wives' tale, if you will, that the early church was trying to figure out a way to get control and political power, and so they started inventing these different ideas and beliefs, and that's where Christianity or Orthodox Christianity came from. This isn't really what the historical record shows at all. So what's going on? Where does the Trinity come from? Why is it not found in the Bible? You're not going to find Trinity or triune or three in one or anything like that in the text of Scripture anywhere at all. That doesn't mean we don't believe it, and it doesn't mean it's not who God is. So where did it come from? Why does it exist? I want to start there because I think that's probably the most helpful in going forward and understanding why is this an essential? Why is it that I, as a Christian, I ought to believe in a God who is both one and three? And so that's where we're going to hit it off. All of this conversation in the early church centers on the person of Jesus and centers on his nature and his relationship with the Father. So the Trinity is going to form from the clarification of churches' belief and teaching on who God is, specifically who Jesus is. Right? So it's this thing that actually comes out of this conversation that's more directly related to who is Jesus. And so something to keep in mind is one of the things that the early church is having to kind of battle against is on the one hand you've got the polytheism of the Roman Empire and the Greek mythology and all of that that's kind of at work and at play among the Gentiles. So you've got cultic worship at the temples and stuff like that. But then the other issue is you have this almost rabid monotheism in Judaism, right? So that you've got this very ingrained idea that there is one God and only one God that was very, very unique in the first century in the Roman Empire. And so these two things are going to be important because they are these ideas that most of the converts to early Christianity held to, right? So you have lots of Jews who are coming to faith in Jesus as the Messiah. They then are coming from this monotheistic background, but then you have a bunch of Gentiles coming from this polytheistic background who are believing that Jesus is the Messiah. And it's really important to set the record straight. Like, it is very clear from the historical record that the early church believed that Jesus was God. There was no real doubt about it. What wasn't clear yet is what exactly that meant and how that worked. But the early church undeniably believed. And when I say early, I'm talking 2nd century. We have documented letters and confessions and baptismal formulas outside of the New Testament that the early church very clearly claimed that Jesus was God. So the question is, how can he be God? Are there multiple gods, right? That would be more the polytheism. Is there just this one God and Jesus is that God? That would be more coming from the Judaistic mindset of monotheism. So the early church is kind of wrestling through all of this. And as they're confessing and taking their stand and saying that Jesus is God, what begins to happen is explanations of how that work start to pop up. As those explanations pop up, error in how that works begins to pop up. And so the controversy is always going to center on the nature and explanation of who Jesus is. It's not a bunch of people sitting around going, hey, I got an idea. Let's make up a God who's 3 in 1. The controversy surrounds the person of Jesus, as it usually does in the early church affairs and questions. So we'll start with a kind of a working definition. This is going to kind of help guide us in our understanding of the Trinity. We'll use this as we go forward for multiple things, but we believe, our definition of the Trinity is that we believe that there is one God who has eternally existed in 3 persons. One God who has eternally existed in 3 persons. So this is 2019 definition of the Trinity. You're not going to find this in some like early creed somewhere where they come out and say this. This is we're looking back in history and saying here's the statements that they're making. So first, there is one God. The divinity of Jesus and the oneness of God is one of the early questions that the church is wrestling with. Is Jesus God? Okay, if Jesus is God, then what's his relationship to the Father? The God of the Old Testament. If Jesus is God, is he the God of the Old Testament? Is he somehow different from the God of the Old Testament? Was he sent by the God of the Old Testament? Is the Old Testament even true? Should we even be believing it? Probably even more earlier question than that, a more important question than that, is if Jesus is God, how can he suffer? Right, there was this assumption that was held by a lot of people that would utterly separate God from this physical, evil, dirty world. And so the idea that God could come down as a creature of some sort and suffer and die was unthinkable. And so in order to avoid this, some of the earliest errors are going to actually deny Jesus' humanity. They're going to say that he was God, but he did not actually suffer and he did not actually die because he was not actually human. What they will say is that he appeared to die. He appeared to suffer. That he had some sort of veiled spirit or veiled soul that looked physical, that was not actually human flesh and blood. Ignatius, one of the early church fathers, is going to assert against this, that no, he really actually physically was human. Jesus, the Son of God, was a real human who really ate and really drank and really died and was really resurrected. And he goes on to say, for if he wasn't, then how is he doing anything that's helpful for us? Because if our great enemies are sin and death, how is a spirit coming down and not dying and not resurrecting helping us at all with sin and death? Right, so it's really a question of the cross. Side note, I think it's really interesting that in the early church, the question was not, is Jesus God? That had been pretty much was a settled assumption among the people of the time. The question was Jesus really human? Fast forward 2,000 some odd years later, our question, Jesus, for most people, is not did Jesus really exist, but instead is Jesus really existed. We know the man, human Jesus, historically existed. Very, very, very few historians, Christian and otherwise, deny that. The question is, was he really God? Right? And so we kind of flip that, whereas the historical record says that no, that there was this person that did miracles and did this crazy stuff. We just don't know if he was really actually human or if he just appeared to be human. I think that's kind of a fascinating reality. So the church is going to come out and they're going to say, no, he was really human. He did actually suffer. Jesus is God and human. So at the same time, they're going to simultaneously confess that there is only one God. That the church is faced with the opportunity to begin to say, no, there are multiple gods. There are two gods. There is the God of the Old Testament, and then there's this other God, this second God that is somehow other than that God, and this is the God Jesus. They deny that, right? They don't fall into any type of polytheism. They maintain the witness of the Old Testament, which very clearly says there's one God, and the New Testament, by the way. And they hold that. They take that very seriously. They don't throw that away. There were some during this time who were trying to get rid of the Old Testament and say that it was not worthwhile, that it was not from God. But the church says, no, we believe the Old Testament. We think the Old Testament is true. We believe the Old Testament is revelation from God. And we believe because of that what the Old Testament says about God. And so we know that God is one, and we know that Jesus is God. And so how does this actually work? So the next kind of natural problem that arose from this is, okay, so there is one God, and we believe that Jesus is God, and we believe the God of the Old Testament, and so Jesus must be the God of the Old Testament, in the sense that Jesus is the Father, right? That there is Yahweh, who is the Father of the Old Testament, and there is the Son, Jesus, but he's not really the Son. He just makes that claim that he is somehow the Father of the Old Testament, that he is the fullness of God. He is all that God is, and there is nothing more outside of him, right? So when Jesus is praying to the Father, for example, he's not really praying to anything other than himself. More importantly, what these erroneous Christians would say is that when Jesus is dying on the cross, the Father is dying on the cross. That the Father dies and then the Father resurrects himself. But the problem is that the language throughout the New Testament eliminates this as a possibility, right? The second and third person pronouns in the Gospels alone, where Jesus very clearly talks to the Father, calls him he, and talks to him in a one-to-one conversation, calling him you, right? There is a me and a you in those conversations with Jesus. Jesus seems himself to bear witness that there is this God that is somehow not part of him in some kind of way. And so what do we do with that? So the early church, Tertullian specifically, is going to argue that this actually leads to polytheism. And this is an interesting argument. That this idea that the Old Testament God actually becomes Jesus in the New Testament and dies on the cross, what he argues is that if the Father dies on the cross, then the Father has to resurrect himself. And if the Father resurrects himself, then that is the power that we will one day be resurrected by. And so his argument is this: if the Father is dead and is somehow being resurrected by this other power, that this actually points to polytheism and not to monotheism. That there is this other power of resurrection. There's this power outside of the dead Father who is able to resurrect the dead Father, so he must be more powerful than the Father. And it is that Father, or it is that power that raises the dead. Therefore, there must be more than one deity. Tertullian rejects this, of course, and says, no, we do not believe that the Father died on the cross. We believe that the Son died on the cross. We also believe that the Son is fully 100% God, and yet somehow distinct from the Father. And this is the articulation that's going to come later on in the church's history. But for now, what they're doing is they're identifying that, one, there is one God, and two, that Jesus is it. Confronting the second and third person pronoun problem in the New Testament, right? The idea that Jesus would just pray to himself is one of the more minor arguments against this. The biggest one the church had was the cross. And so we don't believe that Jesus is actually praying to himself. He's actually really praying to God. So there is some kind of distinction between the Son and the Father. The next one would be very similar to this, that Jesus is the Father. Well, he's not the Father, so there's this distinction between the Father and the Son. Well, maybe there was this man named Jesus, and somehow, for some reason, God chose him, and God took his Spirit and put him in him, right? And so there would have been they wouldn't have thought of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, as a separate, somehow, person of the Trinity at this point. That the Father the deity, the Father, has a Spirit. And that he took his Spirit that's at work throughout the Old Testament, who's the same as the Father. He took that Spirit and he takes that Spirit and puts it inside of this human named Jesus. So that Jesus is really just a human being who's walking around with the full Spirit of God within him. It's an interesting argument. The problem is that Jesus becomes divine at some point. Right, so they would argue either it happened at his baptism, when the Spirit descends on him like a dove, or that it happened to him at his resurrection, when he, by the power of the Spirit, is resurrected from the dead. That the man Jesus is somehow being given this Spirit. So the Spirit of God becomes incarnate, rather than the Father becoming incarnate. And this is confusing because in the early church, they're using the word Spirit in two ways. One, they use it to describe the Holy Spirit, which would be the second person of the Trinity that they've not yet quite articulated yet. The second is that they use it to describe the divine nature. So in the same way that we call Jesus the Son of God, what we mean by that is that Jesus is somehow divine, somehow God. They would use that word Spirit to describe the same thing. So they would say Jesus, the man, and then Spirit as in the divine person or the divineness of Jesus. And so we don't really know when they're talking about the Spirit as in like this Old Testament thing that the Father sent to Jesus, or when they're just simply talking about the divine nature of Jesus. And so there's some confusion on that. At the end of all this, this idea was dismissed by simply pointing back to the Old Testament, and specifically Psalm 110, verse 1, where there seems to be this distinction between the Messiah, Jesus, the Son, and the Lord, Yahweh, the Father. That in the Old Testament itself, there seems to be some sort of distinction between these two lords. There's the Yahweh, and then there's the Adonai, and you can look at these in Psalm 110. That's a whole other conversation. But they use Psalm 110 to kind of identify the fact that there does seem to be some distinction here. That the God of the Old Testament is not simply sending his Spirit into a man, and the God of the Old Testament is not simply coming down as a man, that there's something else going on here. And so these errors are dismissed, and what begins to take center stage becomes the kind of impetus for one of the biggest arguments or controversies in the early church's history. And silver lining is it caused the church to articulate what they actually believed in detail and specifically. And it caused the early church to come together and formulate something that everyone could agree on. Like this is actually what we've been teaching for 200 to 300 years. And so it was actually very helpful, even though it was a controversy. And so the question becomes, okay, so if we've got these two divine beings, right? The God of the Old Testament and Jesus. So what do we do with the relationship between Jesus and the Father? If they're not the same God, but there's somehow only one God, then Jesus must be somehow lesser than God. He's this second God, or he's this demigod that's somehow subservient to the Father, to Yahweh, to the God of the Old Testament. And so the church, demanding a distinction, is going to come up with this solution of this natural, not the church, those within the church are erroneously going to come to the conclusion of some sort of natural subordination, making the Son out to be some sort of lesser being created by the Father, or in some cases an angel, or in some cases some sort of demigod or creature of some type. Probably the biggest and most popular of these is Arius. Arius is going to say that God can't have direct contact with creation, and so he creates this intermediary, Jesus, so that he creates through Jesus, this logos, this word of God. That Jesus is going to be the one that God creates so that Jesus can then create and redeem creation. But that God, even though he is the first of all created things, and even though he's above all created things, is below the Father. He is not the same thing, and that's the key. He is not the same thing as the Father. He's not the same thing as capital G, God. So this comes about from the use of the word Son to describe the divine nature of Jesus. This is what the New Testament describes Jesus as. The church, because of the errors earlier on, moves away from this description of Jesus' divine nature as describing it as the Spirit of Jesus, and they begin to describe Jesus as the Son of God. Well, the natural implication was if he's the Son of God, then he's somehow lesser than or subservient to the Father. I think it's important to make this note at this point, like these metaphors are being used to describe God, going back to our initial point that God is mysterious. These metaphors are being used to describe God because they have to. Like, all language is going to fall short. We're never going to be able to come up with a word or definition or phrase that is going to encapture everything about who God is and what he's like. And so we can't look at the phrase Son of God and import a ton of ideas and stuff in there. Like, everything that might mean isn't necessarily what was meant when that metaphor was used, if that makes sense. And so what they mistakenly understood, or what some mistakenly understood the Son of God to mean, was that he was some sort of creature of, created being of, or came out of the Father in a way that there was a time when he did not exist, and then he was birthed, and now he had a son. And so the way that some people properly kind of describe this is that God, there was a time when God was not a father, and then God created Jesus, and at that time God became a father because he now had a son. And that's, I think, a helpful way to understand the error there. So that Jesus, the Son of God, has not always existed. He was not eternal. The way that they would kind of combat this is there was never a time when he was not. Right? So Jesus has eternally existed. He's always existed. The Son of God, there's never been a time when the Son of God did not exist. In other words, he's not a created creature. He's not a created being. And so this is going to eventually lead the church to their earliest and one of their most popular councils, the Council of Nicaea in 325, where many of the bishops get together and they specifically and they clearly confess the nature of Jesus' relationship to the Father. And two of the things that they confess are that Jesus is begotten, not made. So that he is the Son of God who somehow proceeds from the Father, but he is not proceeding from the Father in a way that somehow intimates that he was created by the Father or is lesser than the Father. And they nail the second point, right, that he is somehow not lesser than the Father, by saying that Jesus is in fact true God from true God. He is true light from true light. The illustration or the analogy that they would use is a torch, right? So if I have a torch, and I take another torch and I light it, that flame, even though that flame separates and becomes two different flames, those two flames are of the same essence. They are of the same quality. And that's how they would describe the nature of Jesus. Not that there are two gods, but that the nature and essence of God is one in both the Father and in the Son. And this leads us to our second part of our definition. Okay, we'll get to that in the next episode.